Hello everyone and welcome to the latest Sempre Milan audio bulletin. Thank you for tuning in, first of all, and taking the time to listen to this, and I hope you're having a fantastic week, whatever it is that you're up to. So, I apologise in advance, because this is not going to be the most cheery of episodes. However, it's something that I've been wanting to sit down and record for a while. It actually started out initially as a feature idea for the website, and I still might get around to penning my thoughts, but as I was drafting out the structure for this, and I will be referring to pre-written bullet points, so I make sure I hit as much as I can and do the topic as much justice as possible, I realised that I had too much to say, and therefore it was probably best to put this across in the form of an audio bulletin, which is why you're listening to this right now. I also put off the recording of it for some time. I originally thought about sitting down and doing it a month ago, but it became a matter of timing. It became a matter of looking back at what I wanted to say and making sure that I'd hit on everything, essentially that the structure was correct for it. And then ultimately I got to a point now where I just thought, let's do it. So it may be a little bit rough, a little bit raw, but I hope you understand that a lot of it comes from things that we've pieced together, information we hear, reports from reliable sources, but also a lot of it comes from the heart, because ultimately we started this website as fans of AC Milan, and we still write as fans. We want the club to do as well as possible, and that means we're also not afraid of holding them to account. And that is where we come to the perfect storm, and that's what I've decided to title this, because I believe that when people talk about who to blame, or perhaps a particular aspect with the club that they feel is solely responsible for why we are underperforming relative to previous levels, which I'm going to come on to, I think it's too simplistic to put it on one thing, essentially. And I think that there are numerous key contributing factors to why we are where we are. And when I say where we are, people will point out we're not a Spurs, we're not a Manchester United in the bottom half of the table and, sort of the laughing stock of the country that they play in. However, I think it's important to recall where we were, after we won the 2021-2022 Scudetto, which we all believed was a platform for greater things, and we were being spoken about from the outside looking in as a symbol of a revival of a fallen giant, and people used to speak about Milan's drop-off, how we weren't what we were before. And while we never really got back to those elite levels, barring sort of a Champions League semi-final and, of course, winning the league title, the fact that we were in and amongst the title discussion again, back in the Champions League, things going well off the field, led to people pointing at us and kind of saying this is a model of how to rebuild a club that has been through some dark days, as we did in the 2010s. And sort of into the late Berlusconi years, and then obviously the ownership under Yong-Hong Lee. So I think the best way to do this, and the way that I intend to cover the topic, is to go from top to bottom and to do it in 5 sections. So I'll start with the ownership, because I believe that any successful football club needs a solid ownership. And I'm going to try my best to stay away from using the same phrase over and over again, but competency comes into mind, and ambition. Competency and ambition, I believe, are sort of the 2 magic ingredients that you need to try and make a winning football club. And when I say a winning football club, it's different for each team, but in our case it means winning silverware, at least a trophy per season, let's say, whether it's a cup, a super cup, or whether it's the league title. We're a club that, with 50 major honours in our 125th season, we expect to win trophies more often than not. So we come to the actual takeover of the club, which was completed just after we won the league title. We transitioned from Yong-Hong Lee's ownership in 2017-18 into Elliott Management, who of course acquired the club essentially by default because Yong-Hong could not repay the debts that he owed the hedge fund. We had a bit of stability, should we say, under Elliott, who never really set out to own a football club, but when they acquired Milan, it was reported at the time, and it was reported even more so after the fact, i.e. after they sold the club, that a few of their members, in particular Gordon Singer, became quite invested emotionally in the running and in, the day-to-day operations, but above all in the story of being the owners of Milan. And that is why I think we saw such a successful sort of transition period under them. They inherited difficult circumstances, the accounts were in a real mess. They brought in the right people to kind of try and not just steady the ship, but turn it round in the right direction again and get it swimming in calmer waters. And they succeeded in doing so. They were the ones who first adopted the cost containment strategy in order to get on the right side of financial fair play. But in doing so, they trimmed a lot of excess off the squad and they got it back to a base that was then able to build from. And it wasn't that they were scared of making investments either. Under Elliott, people forget we spent 35 million on Lucas Paquetá, 35 million on Krzysztof Piątek, but it was then the core that we would build under them, and we'll come on to the directors that worked under Elliott as well. But it all culminated in the Scudetto in 2021-22 under Stefano Pioli as the head coach, of course. We all remember the celebrations of that day in Sassuolo, winning 3-0 to clinch the 18th league title. It was a fantastic day, and many of us believed it to be a starting point rather than a destination. And I think that's quite important and quite poignant when you look back on it. Then, of course, the news comes out that the club has been sold to Redbird Capital, another fund from the United States, beat off a rival bid from Investcorp. There was also talk of some interest from the Middle East there too. It did feel a bit at the time as though Elliott had done a convenient deal for them, for matters that we will come on to. But it was a timing thing. I think everybody was a little bit concerned about the idea of such a big change. It's the biggest change you can make, changing the actual owners of the football club straight after winning a league title, and what that might do in terms of thwarting, perhaps even reversing our momentum. And then you start to look a little bit more into what Redbird's modus operandi might be as a fund and as an ownership group. And you realise that this is their first big foray, or rather, it's their first rodeo, shall we say, when it comes to being the actual outright owners and runners of a sporting organisation that's this large. They have invested in various groups that own clubs, the links with Fenway Sports Group. They are also in with Toulouse, but again, it's different expectations there. They took on one of the biggest jobs that's possible, and I think Jerry Cardinale knew that from day one, the challenges that lay ahead of him, not just because of the pressure and expectations that Milan fans have and that naturally comes with running a club of our size, but also the challenges that Italian football poses, from Serie A up to government bureaucracy. Again, we will come on to that. Cardinale as well, I think he had an important task, important responsibility to instantly connect with the fans who wanted reassuring that this was a step forward for the club and not something that might destabilise the previous good work that was done. And I think some of his comments right off the bat were quite questionable. He did mention in an early interview that he didn't know that the team had won 7 Champions Leagues. That is something that us as fans are most proud of, in terms of a sporting achievement. He's had good and bad comments since, I think it would be fair to say. And we know that he is personally involved, and we know he has attended many games in the past. He's not at every game, but it can be difficult for owners to do that. But it has been a mixed bag in terms of how he's been received, and I would say it's more on the negative side. And this sort of then feeds into what Redbird Capital are as a fund and how they will intend to run the club. Yes, Cardinale has spoken about his desire to win, spoke about being the person that wants to win the most and things like that. But he's then said in follow-up interviews that he wants to win, but by doing so in a sustainable manner, about having investors to please as well as fans, who he would rightly consider stakeholders in the club too, even if just emotionally. But basically, he wants to win, but not at all costs. Now, we've seen what all costs, in quotations, means for us in 2017-18. Go out and spend all that money, don't get anything in return, and it can set the club back years from an accounting perspective, and with the settlement agreement we had to sign, everything that came with it. So it's winning with responsibility, and we all like that idea. The idea that we can continue to spend well within our means, continue to have healthy accounts, and we can continue to win on the field too, right? Because that's the balancing act that's at play here. Can we be a profitable organisation, or at least a financially healthy club, but also continually be topping up that trophy cabinet with silverware? It's a hard balance to strike, as I think he's found. And then you look around the league, because I think one of the biggest indicators of the ownership's ambition is the cost of the squad. Now, squad cost means basically the transfer fees amortised. So all the transfer fees that you've spent on the squad, effectively divided over the length of the contracts at play, added up. And it's quite a difficult one to explain, but if you Google any of our previous articles, you'll find an explanation for what that means in terms of squad costs. But then you're adding the wage bill onto that as well. I think that in previous years it has been a point of criticism from the fan base, and rightly so, that our squad costs have been below Juventus and Inter. Our wage bill remains substantially below that of Inter, and something that I think is a common theme that I refer to and that other fans refer to is that we should at least aspire to be the best team in our city. Otherwise, how far can we really go? But Inter continually pay out more on salaries, and they've won things ultimately, while also being in a difficult economic position. They've done well in that sense. I'd say that they've achieved domestic dominance, but not in the sense of winning multiple league titles in a row. It's more been that they've either won a Scudetto or a Coppa Italia and a Super Coppa. Basically, they've had trophies most years under Simone Inzaghi, and they've trimmed that gap to us now. And then you've got, for example, two clubs who, in the summer, Napoli and Juventus, decided to usher in new eras by going for new head coaches, obviously Antonio Conte and Thiago Motta respectively, back them with 150 million plus in spending, while we're here continuing to impose a per signing limit of 20 million euros effectively. And the coach is another interesting theme, because I think that's another symbol of how ambitious an ownership group wants to be. We decided to move on from Stefano Pioli in the summer, and we went for Paulo Fonseca after originally being linked with Julen Lopetegui, which then sparked a protest, of course. We went for Fonseca, and we were paying him 2.5 million net per season. Pioli, at the time that he was relieved of his duties, was earning 4 million net per season. So we decided that Stefano Pioli was no longer good enough to be the head coach of Milan, and I think we can all agree that it was the right... Not all agree, but the majority seemed to suggest at the time that it was the right moment to move on from Pioli after nearly 5 years in charge and to bring somebody new in. But what we were effectively saying by paying Fonseca nearly half of what Pioli earns is that we've hired a coach that didn't deserve to make as much money. And that's quite a problematic stance to have from the off. Yes, you can say that he needs to earn his stripes and then might have got a renewal for higher money like Pioli did, but I just don't think that it sends out the right message when you've got Napoli paying up for Conte, Juventus winning the race to get Motta from Bologna. I think it was a difficult stepping stone for most fans to try and comprehend and to try and digest. And I think everything that we've seen, from the squad costs, from the coaching decision in the summer, we're going to come on to the management that's been assembled. It feeds into this notion that Redbird and Cardinale, as the top of the club, as the figurehead of the club, are not going to go out and spend what they judge to be reckless sums of money in order to compete and win instantly. But what we see as necessary expenses in order to bridge the gap that's opened up with the teams that are now above us. We're in 8th place in the table for a reason, and we're close to 20 points off top spot, and we're in January. That is not acceptable. And then we come to the uncertainty that exists over the actual structure of the deal that saw us pass from Elliott to Redbird. Now, the vendor loan has sort of become a buzz phrase as well among supporters, who seem to suggest that it's destabilising in its very nature, to the journalists who have tried to explain what it all means. There are various articles about the vendor loan specifics and figures and things like that. But ultimately, we come to the fact that Elliott retained some influence within the club by having Gordon Singer still as a board member, and the vendor loan is almost like a guarantee that they will not be, they won't be fully off the scene until it's all repaid. That's not me saying that they're interfering on a day-to-day basis or anything like that, but it's more like a necessary guarantee on their part that, that they're going to get their money back, effectively. Then the fact that the actual terms of the loan itself were restructured during recent months, as was officially communicated by the club, is essentially refinanced to shift the deadline for the repayment a couple of years into the future. It sort of opens up more uncertainty. Now, what we learned is that Cardinale was surprised at the reaction to this because he thought that it was sort of guaranteeing a further period of stability in that we don't have to worry about a ticking time bomb in the summer of 2025 anymore because the deadline's been expected. So we've got at least a couple more years of Redbird. However, the fans, and when I say the fans, I always refer to the general consensus, seem to see it as, where is this money going to eventually come from? Is it reliant on other things? Is it suggestive that Elliott may actually come back in control of the club? There are a lot of questions floating around. And ultimately, we're none the wiser as to what it really means and the tangible day-to-day running of the club. Maybe it means nothing. Maybe it literally is just buying more time to pay back. My own personal theory, which I've pieced together from various bits of information, is that a lot of it relates to the stadium project. And again, when I talk about Redbird and I talk about a modus operandi, a lot of it was to do with off-field matters such as the stadium project. Cardinale did speak about winning on the field being important, but it was kind of drowned out by the rest of his messages, which were all about turning Milan into a sports and entertainment product above all, by tackling things like TV rights and media production, that kind of thing. He wanted us to build our own stadium, or to build a new stadium with Inter, which, we keep flip-flopping between which we want to do. Isaac's done brilliant bonus pieces on that before. And ultimately, we're in a position with the stadium where it's actually probably not much closer to being built than when we changed hands to Redbird Capital. And that is one of the big things that they said. They championed it. They shouted loud about the fact that they'd be able to not only build us a new stadium, but they'd actually be able to set up some kind of company, or I guess some kind of expertise service, to help other clubs within Serie A build their own stadium. And where it ties back, I think, to the ownership situation in the vendor loan is all to do with the value of the club. So Redbird Capital took over the club for €1.2 billion, or at least that was the valuation of the club at the time of takeover. My belief with the vendor loan and the balance that's still to be paid is that once you get spades in the ground on the stadium project and we start seeing actual concrete put down, the formalities are all done and the stadium is in the process of being built, the value of the club will rocket up to maybe 1.5, 1.6, maybe even closer to 2 billion, because all of a sudden you're adding to the asset worth that the club will have, and you're adding to the potential future earnings from a revenue standpoint that the club will gain. So I think you'll see a hike in the valuation of the club. I think that's when Redbird would cash their chips in and get the profit that comes from having the stadium project underway, use that profit to repay Elliott. They will then keep the rest. That is, again, it's pieced together from bits, and it's my personal gut feeling is that a lot of the ownership situation comes down to the stadium project because of what that will do to the valuation of the club. So, going on the top-down theme, we come to the management, and this is where I will refer from point to point. The ownership situation, when perhaps you haven't got an ownership group that want to win at all costs, you then get a management in place that perhaps might not be built to do so. And I think that Milan currently have a sporting structure where nobody is actually a perfect fit for their role. Now, that might not sound like a damning statement, but when you think about it, it is, because they determine so much of what actually goes on in terms of the present, the immediate future, the medium term and the long term future of the club. These are the people that are in charge of the directives on that side. And a lot of it is playing side as well, but there's more than that at stake here. Jerry Cardinale has said in the past that his right-hand man now is Zlatan Ibrahimovic. And he is almost the symbolic enigma of what people adjudge to be the incompetency of the management. First of all, he's the senior advisor, which is effectively a made-up position because he doesn't hold the qualifications to be a sporting director or a technical director. But he is the number two when it comes... There's Cardinale number one, and Zlatan Ibrahimovic is the number two. That has been made clear by Cardinale himself. Now, Zlatan as a player is somebody that we all adored. You know, during his two separate spells, he gave so much to Milan, dragging us out of difficult moments. And he was a character, you know. He was so outspoken, such an interesting guy, and ultimately he would give you a brilliant quote every week. But then he'd go out and back it up on the field. You know, he might talk about lions and things in the media, and he might give some bizarre statements, and you know, at times he would be almost strange, and you'd think, is this all an act? But he would be able to go out on the field and score you a winning goal or score you a hat-trick that weekend. So it's different, Zlatan, the player, to what we see now, which is him, you know, with a suit and tie on, behind a desk, having to do things, being as involved as he can be, of course, but also not being able to go out on the field and impact things in the way that he's used to. He rules the roost, as mentioned, and I think that he wasn't going to come back unless he had quite a lot of decision-making power. I think that what people have grown... what the fan base in general has grown frustrated with Zlatan is that in such a period of uncertainty for the club, we hoped that he could be the glue to bring everything back together. Because he'd be involved day to day at Milanello, speaking with the squad and helping to mentor players as he did when he was still a player. He'd be able to speak to potential new signings and convince them to join. He'd be able to be the media personality facing the cameras, answering questions with that same charisma that we've always known. In actual fact, we see someone who's not particularly present, who only seems to speak when it's the right time in his eyes, and when he does speak, he tends to answer questions, especially the difficult questions, with jokes, with sarcasm, with similes and metaphors. Very little concrete comes out of Zlatan Ibrahimovic's mouth when he does speak to the media. I think fans are fed up of that too. You know, we're in a time now when we need to see clear direction, and we need to understand what the outline of the plans is to move forward, and we don't need to hear that through riddles. You know, people will say that's his style, that's his character, that's the way that he is. Yes, but I think that sometimes there is a time to kind of drop the veil, drop the fancy dress costume, and speak fan to fan. Because if Zlatan loves the club as much as he says he does, and I don't doubt that, then he must understand that the supporter base at large has a desire for clarity. Then we come to Giorgio Furlani, the chief executive officer who took over from Ivan Gazidis, who we got from Arsenal under Elliott Management's ownership. Now, I think that bit about Gazidis is important because it was a tough act for Furlani to follow, in the sense that Gazidis came, there was a lot of scepticism at the time that he arrived because Arsenal fans didn't particularly like him. So he had to prove himself to us. He worked under tremendously difficult parameters, given the financial issues that Elliott inherited. But he set about using his knowledge that he's acquired and his expertise over the many years to transform Milan from a commercial standpoint. And he did exactly that. He delivered exactly what he said he would. You know, revenues across the board surged upwards, all while the team became more competitive on the field. And I think that he had a communication style that people respected too. Ultimately, he was a commercial and corporate CEO, but he didn't hide that. He didn't try to meddle too much in footballing matters and rather stuck to what he was good at. Then we come to Furlani, who has been around for many years now. He's only taken a prominent role under Redbird's ownership, really. But his background is very on the corporate side. You know, he's worked for previously hedge funds like Goldman Sachs in London. Essentially, never has he held a position at a football club, and then to get that promotion to being the CEO of such a big club like Milan and such a demanding club, you know, it's a difficult one for him, definitely. But I think that he would have been better served just trying to go down the same route as Gazidis in continuing the good work from a commercial standpoint and limiting involvement on the football side as much as possible. That hasn't happened. Fellaini, by the sounds of it, is much more active when it comes to sporting decisions, things like contract negotiations, transfer negotiations. You will see his name mentioned a lot. Now, we're not sat in a room for these discussions, and we don't know how much he commands respect in these rooms. But I can imagine it's one of those things where you kind of grow in confidence on the job, and maybe by now he is a really important cog in doing that. He still remains a character of mystery to me, does Joe Fellaini, because he doesn't speak very much. We know that he's somebody that the ownership wanted to keep on, but we don't actually know what he does every single day. And I think that that's fine as a CEO. It probably should be that way in many ways. Well, I think when fans are pointing the finger everywhere, you're not going to spare somebody like Fellaini from that if they don't see him as being somebody who's doing a lot of good. I do think, generally speaking, he probably gets more criticism than is warranted, and I think that he is quite a difficult in-between in the sense that he's taking directives from above, from Cardinale, and I guess in some cases even Ibrahimovic, but he's also the one who has to appease the accounts, has to ensure that we remain in this newfound financial hell, and also has to ensure that the coach and the players are happy with the product that's being put out on the field, and ultimately, weirdly, as a CEO, you're kind of judged as much on the success on the field as what you do off it, and that shouldn't really be the case. And then we come to Geoffrey Moncada, who is the technical director, but by title, I would say. He assumed that position after Paolo Maldini and Ricky Massara departed. And now we'll mention this a little bit before coming on to Moncada, because Maldini and Massara's exit continues to be spoken about seemingly every single day. And I think for good reason, because they were there and they helped build the winning team that we saw when we won the league title in 2022 after 11 years of wait. Obviously, Paolo Maldini is adored by almost every single member of the fan base. Not just for what he did as a player, but for what he did, and I guess more importantly, what he said as a director. I remember so vividly the interview that he gave during the semi-final against Inter in the Champions League, where he spoke about how we can't judge ourselves to have arrived now. This can't be the end point being here. We need to invest now while we've got something good going in the squad to make sure that we can come back to the Champions League final. I think his words were a prophecy in the sense that since then it's been a pretty steady decline to where we find ourselves now. But people, I think, saw Maldini, I guess Massara, because he was the right-hand man and they worked together as a tandem, saw him as a guarantor that we would be ambitious and a guarantor that they would do everything for the good of the club. And by that, they don't mean the club as AC Milan SPA, the company that has to file the accounts every single year. AC Milan, the club that exists to win trophies and make fans happy. I think that's an important point. Now, what they did in terms of the transfer windows, building the core of the squad that we see today, and then also what they spent the money on after winning the league title deserves a whole separate analysis. But effectively, when you've got somebody, this silent figure, this chief scout by trade in Moncada, stepping up to fill that role, again, like Gazidis to Fellaini, tough shoes to fill and quite a difficult task at hand. Moncada is not very public-facing either. He's done a handful of interviews in the 5-6 years that he's been with us. It's not his style. As mentioned, when I say technical director by title, I mean it because I think a lot of the things that he does are still very much on the scouting side. He's more... people talk about the algorithms and things like that. I don't think that everything that they judge... He's explained his scout process before. Not everything is numbers driven, but he's the one who identifies and goes to watch the players and then is involved in trying to sign the players. But Maldini as a technical director was a bit of a different figure in that sense. This is a collegial working group. Maldini had a lot more power with respect to his individual role. So this is almost a different kind of directorship that we're under at the moment. And a collegial working style is something that has been spoken about as A, why Maldini departed in the first place, and B, sort of why at the moment there might be too many cooks spoiling the broth. Moncada, I think overall, he's been here for a long time now, as mentioned, it's over half a decade. I think you can judge his work to be positive on balance because of the role that he played in identifying the players that currently form the core that we see. You know, Mike Maignan, Teo Hernandez, Rafael Leao, Reinders Pulisic, all those players. We've kind of hit on a niche of signing players that are on the up or signing players that are actually in a bit of a dip but we think can get back there. I think Moncada deserves credit for his talent identification. There's been quite a few misses as well. You know, you can't get everything, and you do wonder for a situation like the signing of Charles de Ketelara, how much was Maldini saying, I really want this signing, or how much was it Moncada saying, this guy has everything that we need to fill the gap, or how much was it everybody saying, nope, this is the guy, we're going to go for him. You know, that's just one situation where you do wonder how that group worked. Now I think Moncada does have a bit more say, and I think that you hear his name popping up more in stories with regards to being an active part of the negotiations, but it all comes back to this thing of he is not a public-facing character. He's actually out of contract at the end of the current season too, so it will be interesting to see what happens on that front and if we renew him. You might say that, you know, what I said before about talent identification, buying players on the up, buying players in a dip, effectively turning what we've spent into players that are worth more. That kind of aligns with Redbird's ownership, and therefore they're likely to keep him on. The info we have is that he is likely to be kept on, but whether there will be the introduction of another figure into the management then remains to be seen. Then there's the president, Paolo Scaroni. I think that he might be the most scrutinised figure within the overall management at Milan. When I say scrutinised, I actually mean criticised. I don't think that the vast majority of supporters particularly like him. He's often contradictory in the press. He sometimes goes against words from other figures within the club. He's called Stadione because that's all he tends to speak about, but even when he speaks about the stadium, He says one thing one week about San Donato being our priority, and then the next week he'll say that San Donato's plan B. I understand he's a figure with weight in the political sphere. You know, he's held some quite high-ranking positions before, and he seems to be well known among the Lega Serie A Council. It is useful to have somebody whose voice is listened to, but they've got to use that voice in the right way, and Scaroni doesn't. He's not a particularly charismatic guy. Nor has he actually actively done anything that fans can point towards and be like, yeah, I'm glad that we've got this guy at the helm of the club. And another thing that I think has been picked up on rightly is that he's now dividing his time because he's been appointed in a position within Redbird in addition to what he has at Milan. So he's now doing two duties on that front. So it goes to show that Cardinale likes him, respects him, holds him in high esteem, that he would bring him on to the Redbird operations. But ultimately, he must be pulling time away from what he does with Milan. And he's also taken up a role as the chairman of Enel, the energy company within Italy. So it's all a little bit bizarre. We don't really know how present Scaroni is in the offices of Casa Milan. And yet he holds the title of president of the club, and that just doesn't sit right to many, for all of the reasons that I've said. I think he is probably the one that people would replace at the click of a fingers, and I haven't seen anything, nor can I build a really solid counter-argument as to why that couldn't be the case. So in the management, to kind of summarise there, you've got a lot of square pegs in round holes, and I don't think we do have... I don't think as a management group it commands much respect at the administratorial, is that a word, level, like you have with Beppe Marotta at Inter, for example. He's well known within the offices of Serie A. Or previously we had Adriano Galliani, obviously when Berlusconi was in charge. So I don't think it's an ownership group that is going to fight our corner successfully in the most important offices to do with the running of the league. And I think that there is a figure lacking as well, and that is the sporting director. I spoke before about Ibrahimovic ruling the roost. He was supposedly the key man behind the sacking of Antonio D'Ottavio as the sporting director, who himself was a bit of a mythical figure, but there was a disagreement over the plans for the futuro and various aspects to do with the running of the club. We now don't have a sporting director, nor did we have a proper sporting director before, even with D'Ottavio, because we didn't hear much from him. We didn't know an awful lot about what he did on a daily basis. So that gap has now opened up, and I will come on at the end to how to potentially fix all of this. But yeah, as mentioned, a lot of figures within there that are kind of doing jobs that isn't what they normally do. You got Zlatan learning on the job at arguably the worst possible time. It isn't a management group that, for me, inspires a lot of faith. Then we come to the head coaching position, and filtering down, and perhaps unambitious ownership group then assembles a management that isn't really fit for purpose, which then appoints a head coach and builds a squad that isn't good enough. You know, it's all drip feeding down into what we see as the product put out on the field week in, week out. I kind of mentioned before about the hiring of Paulo Fonseca in the summer, and how that was like a watershed moment in how people would judge the ownership group and the managerial team, because it was kind of a statement of ambition. Are you going to go out and get a proven winner? Are you going to go and spend top dollar on a coach who you believe will take the club forward towards winning silverware, or are you going to take a gamble? Now, Fonseca had merits upon his arrival. He'd done a good job at Lille. He'd had success with Shakhtar and in Portugal. He had Serie A experience from his time at Roma, admittedly a bit of a mixed bag. On paper, he had a clear style of play, one that was actually entertaining and possession-based and to do with dominating games effectively. He's shown that he's good with developing young players. He especially showed that at Lille. And I think he was regarded as quite a charismatic guy as a coach. But he also had demerits as well, and I think that you could argue they probably outweigh in terms of we weren't in a position to take a risk on the head coach. They had to be a guaranteed upgrade on Pioli, and yet we ended up with somebody like Fonseca. He wasn't regarded as a top coach. You know, nobody would call him an elite coach, nor does he have a history of winning things in the biggest leagues. You say he's not had the opportunity yet, but you know that's all we had to judge was the CV on paper to that point. He didn't get most of the fan base on board from day one as a result, because they wanted an Antonio Conte. Some even wanted Maurizio Sarri or Max Allegri because of their inside-out knowledge of the league. Some would have even rather said, okay, if we're going to take a risk, let's go for one of the really young and up-and-coming coaches like Roberto De Zerbi, who's doing a pretty good job at Marseille at the moment. He wasn't the first-choice name for anyone, it felt like, apart from the directors in charge. And I think that when you set off on such a negative foot, it's hard to get everybody back on side. Obviously, he no longer has his job as the head coach, but I think during his brief tenure, it was only 24 games, we saw everything that we kind of feared that we might. He had differences with star players, his man management left quite a bit to be desired. He took on methods that Pioli had been, I think, a little bit fearful to, by sort of going at Leao and Teo and saying we need more. He wasn't afraid to bench the stars. He rotated the captain's armbands. And it sort of led to, I think, some accusations that he was kind of fighting fire after fire just to try and keep everybody on side. I do believe that his relationship with the star players, particularly those two on the left flank, were what led to his demise, really. Inability to get the best out of them and a bit of friction that was developing within the squad. You know, the results have to then be very good in order for the management to look at that and say he's doing the right thing. And they weren't good enough, you know. We're not any higher in the league table now after games under Sergio Conceição, but ultimately the foundation had been laid by such a poor start to the season. His press conferences were a bit of a roller coaster as well, in the sense that he seemed to have an interesting way of dealing with the media, and as it turns out from comments like what Leao has said, where he mentioned that he was benched but he never once got an explanation, he did a lot of his talking through the media when you look back. He's spoken, for example, about how it was privileged to feel the pressure of being the head coach of Milan, but then he's also spoken about how miserable a job it can be, and how being a coach of a club like that, you don't get much sleep at night. As mentioned, he's openly criticised players, but then spoken of his own accountability for the results. Then in terms of the playing style that we saw on the field, only briefly did you really get the feeling that he was building something, and that was after the Derby win, where he switched to kind of that surprise 4-4-2 system, and then the Real Madrid win in the Champions League. We saw flashes of good play, but by the end of his tenure, it kind of felt like any ambitions, any path that we were on to implementing fully and totally this possession-based domination style of play had gone out the window. We were really, really struggling to break teams down. The defensive record had improved a little bit, but seemingly at the expense of the same attacking threat. As mentioned, star players getting a little bit disillusioned, and it is a results business. In Europe we did well, won 4 on the spin prior to his sacking. But we'd only really seen one game, the Real Madrid one, to suggest that a run deep into the competition was possible. Domestically, the results were not good enough. The club remain at risk of missing out on the Champions League places because of what has been a disastrous start in terms of points pace. And ultimately, he was the fall guy for, I think, I will say, a mess above him and a mess below him in terms of the squad that was assembled. But ultimately a mess that he didn't really help to fix himself either. It is very, very, very difficult to be in a position like the one that he was in and to deliver perfect results. But you've got to give yourself the best chance of doing so. And I don't think that he did that during his time at Milan ultimately. And, I think the way that the club handled his sacking was far from exemplary. In fact, I think in many ways it was disgusting, going into that Roma game with all of the rumours and then sacking him the morning after. But that era is over. It was a short era, and I think a lot of supporters during the summer who said to the management, you are going to pay for an appointment that wasn't what many people wanted, have ultimately been given the ammunition to say we told you so. And obviously, I think a lot of people wish Fonseca the best in his future endeavours, wherever that might end up. I think it was a case of probably potentially the right coach, but at the wrong time. In the sense that if he'd come in earlier for a transition project, then he might have had more time to assimilate his methods. But you could also argue it was the wrong coach at the wrong time for us. So we then come on to the squad. And when you've got a management that has built a substandard squad, and you've got a head coach who is not the right one to then get the best out of this squad, you start to see the holes become massive chasms. But just speaking more generally on the current squad that Milan have, I believe the technical level, both the ceiling in terms of what they're capable of on a technical level and just the average technical level of the players, to not be adequate, really. Especially to consistently carry out the vision of football that Fonseca had. This leads to errors and a big disparity in the results. And I think that as a playing style, we became relatively easy to combat in that sense too. But effectively what I'm trying to say with that is that we have a group of players here who have previously thrived trying to play a style in transition. Whereas when Fonseca came in and he tried to get this possession-based, you might call it tiki-taka style of footballing, it didn't really mesh and gel particularly well with the players at disposal. For example, you see Reinders doing really well because he's a great technical midfielder. He's on 8 goals for the season, and he really stepped up to a new level under Fonseca. But then you've got Leao and Teo, who was so devastating because of their speed and their tenacity in transition. All that had kind of gone out of the window. So when you got a technical level, And when I say technical level, I do actually mean things like first touch, decision making, ability under pressure, close control, passing, execution, composure, those kind of things. When you've got that being fluctuating and, as an overall average, not particularly good, and then you combine it with what I perceive to be a lack of leadership, it's a recipe for disaster. The best players within the team are inconsistent, as seen this season. Leao's been up and down, Teo's been up and down. You could say the same about other players too, like Maignan. When the best players are inconsistent and the others aren't good enough to pick up the slack when they have these off days, you end up in 8th, which is where we are right now, ultimately. And you end up not being able to win as many games as you should. I do think that you can distill the problems with the squad, and you could say the squad construction, down to that. I don't think the technical level of the team is very high, and the leaders within the squad so often go missing. There's a lack of balance within the squad too, in terms of the construction of it age-wise. It's a very young average age still. There are very few players that are in their prime or with winning experience. And when I say in their prime, I mean those players that are sort of 27 to 30, 31, shall we say. You look at a team like Inter, who we're often compared to for obvious reasons. They do have a lot of players in their prime years. And they have functional depth, and they have experienced players who will come in and give a 6 out of 10 performance when they're called upon by Inzaghi when he has to rotate. We're not really in this position because you've got so many of those players that come in and you don't really know what performance you're going to get out of them. There are so many departments within the team that are incomplete too. The midfield situation is a shambles to me. Yusuf Fofana and Tijani Reinders having to start every game without fail has led to them being overworked, and recently we've seen a drop-off in their performance levels. I think it would be fair to say, you've got Musa and Loftus-Cheek as the backups on paper, but Loftus-Cheek has been out of form and keeps getting injured. Musa's been played more on the right than he has in midfield. Benacera's come back from injury, but he's going to need time before he gets anywhere close to his best levels, if he can get there again. But there's still so many gaps. We don't have a prolific striker. We chose to move away from Joshua Zirkzee in the summer to Alvaro Morata, and then I think kind of panicked into a last-minute loan for Tammy Abraham. Still lacking that really prolific goal scorer, as we have been for many years. The 4-2-3-1 system has been used a lot this season without a backup playmaker, so you're having to advance a midfielder, where we've been without a deputy left-back for such a long time, so Teo's been having to work overtime. The centre-backs, it's a little bit strange what's going on there. You can pick basically any position within the team almost and say that, it's not quite right. It's so far from complete. And the summer transfer window that we had, again, this kind of feeds into the management section prior, has kind of led to the position that we're in the sense that only Fofana has really lived up to the expectations. Emerson Royale has been, I say, so poor that we've actually been actively trying to offload him after 6 months. There was talk of Galatasaray coming in, and then he sustained a serious injury, which means that he's now not leaving. But the management have had to go out and sign a 34-year-old plaster or band-aid, however you want to say it, in Kyle Walker to fill in at the right back position. They had so long to identify the right starting right back moving forward. Such a long runway to figure that signing out. And they go for Emerson Royale, who Spurs fans couldn't wait to get rid of. 6 months later, they're now having to rectify that problem. We invested 18 million plus bonuses on Strahinja Pavlovic to sign him from Red Bull Salzburg. We've seen him in only brief moments. He's been very up and down. I think we can all agree that there's a player in there. If he can channel his aggression in the right way, how is he meant to learn and develop without playing, though? And there's even been talk of him being sold after just a few months to Fenerbahce or Stuttgart or a Premier League club. As mentioned, the strikers that we brought in, not good enough. Unfortunately, we really needed to use the moment moving on from Olivier Giroud to go out and invest in a centre forward for the future. Someone we're going to start every single week and not have any doubts that they're the right man and they're going to deliver, 20 plus goals, all comps in the season. That's not a ridiculous thing to ask, considering the names that we've been linked with in prior windows, but never stumped up the cash to go and get, the likes of Sesko, Gyökeres, even Xerxes. He's not doing too well at Manchester United, but might have done well if he stayed in Serie A. I'd guarantee he'd have done a lot better. Rasmus Højlund, another one we were linked with before United blew it all out of the water. There are good strikers there if you go out and you anticipate the competition and you get there before their asking price gets out of control. And what we've ended up with is a 32-year-old Alvaro Morata for 13 million, who seems to be a bit of a stopgap, and Abraham coming in because I think we were a little bit worried about Luka Jovic being the backup. We keep putting off the big investment in various positions. We keep signing these 20 million midfielders and then wonder why the overall level of the department isn't going up. We keep cheaping out on a striker. I do believe that in football generally you get what you pay for. In the striker position, for example, goals are the easiest currency to measure in terms of how much a player's worth. We will not go and push the boat out and sign that striker that's 30, 40 million. Even like Matteo Retegui, for example, was there on a play in the sense that he's playing in Serie A week in, week out. Atalanta were the ones who went out and got him. Now he's the top scorer in the league. Marcus Thuram, we missed out on. He went to Inter. He was a free transfer, and we chose not to get in a bidding war over wages, which is a whole separate thing on principle. But there he is, firing them towards another title race. We have way too many players within the squad. This is the bottom line, right? Beyond the technical level, the tactical level, beyond the leadership and the inconsistencies, we just have way too many players within the team that if I asked any of you listening now, you would say are not good enough for a Scudetto winning team. And this is a management that inherited a team that did win the title. You might say fortuitously, whatever. But won the title on merit based on the amount of points that we won and the way that we ended that season. And they've since dismantled it to the extent of it now being a team that doesn't even seem to be good enough to get in the top four. And it all comes from what's happening at the very top with the ownership group not wanting to spend top dollar to go out and get real quality, from the management that's been assembled that seemingly don't know how to recruit the right players that are functional to the squad, to then, the changes in head coaches that perhaps haven't enabled us to get the best out of the pieces that we do have. Then you've got other things as well, like injuries, but those are things that you can't really pre-plan for, and that's why I find it difficult to have too much animosity with regards to the injury situation, because every team goes through injuries. The final section is actually on the fans, and it's not something to be critical of the fan base, really, because I believe that generally the Milan fan base, and I also speak of the Curva Sud in this, have been so incredibly supportive up until a point. They have backed the team through very, very difficult moments with unwavering support. But everybody's patience has a limit, and it seems to have gone in the last few weeks. We seem to have gone past the point of no return. You're seeing more and more frequent protests. They showed up to the club's 125th anniversary party and camped outside to express their vocal displeasure towards Redbird and towards Jerry Cardinale, towards certain players within the team that they didn't think were pulling their weight. It's got as close to breaking point as it can without them camping outside the training ground every single day, quite frankly. I said, I just think everybody's patience has a limit. But how did we get to this point? Well, I think back to the Scudetto that we won in 2021-22. I asked the question, did we win it too early? Which sounds bizarre to say, and I know I said we won it on merit, which we did, but was it ever anybody's absolute aspiration going into that season that we had to win the league, that it was our time to do it, that we were definitely better than Inter, and that we were going to do it that year? When you win a league title in that way, it's amazing. It gave us all memories for life, and I will never forget those days towards the end of the season, particularly the Sassuolo one. But when you have something like that, and fans expect it to be a platform rather than a destination, right? Did the demand then become success every year? Then it's like, what is success? Is it that only winning a trophy in a particular season a success? So was the follow-up season, 2022-23, viewed as a failure because we weren't good enough in the league, despite the fact we got to a Champions League semi-final? Did losing to Inter in that case not help things? I think that effectively, when you go back to the banter era, even of the mid-2010s, we all wanted to see Milan climb back up to being a club that was respected in Italy and Europe-wide. And then you win that league title in the way that we did in 2022. And you instantly think, what next? Can we go on and challenge for the Champions League? But I just wondered if we made that jump too soon, effectively. And whether now... whether that accelerated the project to a point where nobody within the management, within the ownership group, the new ownership group, I should say, had the tools or had it in their plans beforehand that, okay, right, now we're going to build a team that's a winner every single year. Did we actually win the title while in a transition, and thus it kind of messed everything else up, is what I'm trying to say. I've done a terrible job of wording that, but you know what I mean. Can success come too soon to the detriment of the overall planning of the club? I think what fans are also frustrated with is that they've seen the soul of the team ripped out. I spoke before about Maldini being, in the eyes of many, a guarantor for the ambition of the club. Don't need to go over that again. His exit generated headlines worldwide. How can Milan get rid of Paolo Maldini? The one who not only is the symbol of the club in terms of what he represents, the records that he holds and everything, but actually the fact that he'd managed to build a winner. How do you get rid of him after that? Sandro Tonali is another one his sale to Newcastle. I think it was difficult for many supporters to separate the economic from the sentimental in that sense, because it's like, brilliant, they paid 70 million plus bonuses to sign a midfielder that probably wasn't worth that, if you take an objective look at it in terms of the transfer valuation, but he was worth that to us because, again, he was the beating heart of the team. He was the boyhood Milanista. He was the one who scored important goals en route to the league title. When you rip that out of the actual centre of the team and you replace with a scattering of 20 million signings, it doesn't surprise me that it feels like there's something a little bit lacking in the starting 11. He was probably future captain material, for example. Then you can come on to, do we have enough Italian players who understand the sense of belonging, who understand the league better? Would that have made everything a little bit easier if we had more of an Azzurri influence? I think that's something else that's a separate topic that deserves to be spoken about. Another point that I've down is, will we always compare ourselves to Inter? And is that right? As mentioned before, I think we can all say that to aspire to be the best team in the city is the bare minimum. Inter have had one of their better periods of success in recent years in terms of winning trophies under Inzaghi. We've seen that trophy gap that we have over them trimmed to just a few, from quite a wide gap prior. Yeah, we won the Supercoppa out in Saudi Arabia for our 50th major trophy. That was absolutely fantastic. It's great to get one over on them. But can you always be constantly tied to your cousins in that way? Do you know what I mean? This is another thing that's quite difficult to explain, but if you're taking every single decision, every major decision that you make with the present and the future of a football club by taking a peek at what's happening on the other side of the Navigli, sometimes it can be quite difficult to get perspective. For example, we're in a much healthier financial position than what they are. So we should feel that our management and our ownership group are doing everything within their powers to make us the most competitive team possible, without having to constantly look across at our neighbours and see what they're doing, and because they're operating by different parameters, and it shouldn't be a copy job, is basically what I'm trying to say. I think sometimes, especially with how successful they've been, yes, there are aspects of their project and their structure that I would actually emulate, considering the mess that we have. But I just think that sometimes comparison is not always healthy. It's the root of unhappiness in that way. And it'd be much easier if we all just focused on keeping our own house in order. Then I come back to the ownership situation again. Would fans only really be happy if the owners changed to, a very, very cash-rich and mega ambitious group from the Middle East who wanted to bring Maldini back. Like, is that what it would really take for fans to feel like we've got our club back? Is it actually about that? Because I know everything starts at the top, and that's the whole point of this, is the trickle-down in incompetency, the trickle-down lack of ambition. That's what the whole point of this is, and that's what's assembled what I in my opinion, is a failed structure. But it isn't always the case necessarily that, you know, you switch owners again and everything is absolutely hunky-dory and that everything all of a sudden becomes perfect. You know, we've still got to spend within our means, because financial fair play remains a thing. It isn't as simple as coming in and throwing 300 million at the squad. Yes, we can leverage our newfound financial strength, most definitely, and we do expect to see more spent on the squad. I think that's a natural expectation that comes with it. But yeah, it isn't necessarily the case that within an instant you change ownership groups and everything that I spoke about before is fixed. Another thing to mention as well at this point in terms of supporters' unhappiness is that they are being treated as customers rather than fans. There's no doubt about that. There's been a lot of fallout about the huge hikes in ticket prices, which I think is fully understandable. You've got protests from the Curran and the AIMC over various aspects of the ticketing. We've been turned into almost a clothing brand as well. You've got all these kits coming out, the fourth kits that are coming out every season. How expensive it is just to buy a shirt now. Fans are being asked to pay up from their pockets to see games and to support the team. They expect to see kind of the product on the field, and I keep speaking about this product on the field. What I mean by that is a more competitive and a winning team. They expect to see that go hand in hand, you know. But anyway, I'll wrap it up here. It's been an over hour long rant, and I apologise for how long it's been, but there was just so much to get through, so much to get off my chest, and, you know, I hope that I've done the topic justice. You could probably combat a lot of what I've said with a more positive viewpoint, and I admit that I've taken quite a pessimistic approach to this, but I think that was the whole point, is that I'm trying to effectively convey that Milan have become a flawed ecosystem within which problems have bred, and it set us back from the initial progress that we made at the start of the decade. And yeah, with that, I again apologise for how sombre it's been, but I hope that you enjoyed it, and let me know your own personal thoughts on any one particular topic that I've talked about within it, if you agree or disagree. But in the meantime, have a fantastic week and keep staying tuned with what we're doing on the Substat, and fingers crossed for 3 points in the next game.